The summer of 2003 blazed across Northern California with a ferocity that firefighters would remember for decades. The Mendocino National Forest became a hellscape of orange flames and choking smoke, consuming everything in its path with an appetite that seemed almost supernatural. But hidden within this natural disaster lay a mystery that would haunt the small town of Pine Ridge for 20 years, until a single discovery would crack open a case that law enforcement had all but forgotten. The Hartwell triplets had been the pride of Pine Ridge, a town so small it barely registered on most maps. Born on the same snowy February morning in 1986, Jessica, Jennifer, and Jamie Hartwell were identical in every way except their personalities. Jessica, the eldest by 7 minutes, possessed a fierce independence that often worried her parents. Jennifer, the middle child, carried herself with quiet intelligence, always observing before speaking. Jamie, the youngest, radiated warmth that drew people to her like moths to flame. Their mother, Eleanor Hartwell, worked double shifts at the local diner to support her daughters after their father had abandoned the family when the girls were only 5. She was a woman carved from the same tough timber as the redwoods that surrounded their town, refusing charity but accepting help when it came disguised as friendship. The 3 girls had become her entire world, and she theirs. On July 15, 2003, the temperature in Pine Ridge reached 107 degrees Fahrenheit. The air hung thick and oppressive, carrying the scent of drought-stressed pine needles and something else, something that made the older residents nervous. The triplets, now 17 and on the cusp of their senior year, had planned to spend the day at Crystal Lake, a hidden gem nestled deep in the forest that only locals knew about. Eleanor had been reluctant to let them go. The fire danger was extreme, red flag warnings blanketed the region, and she had an unsettling feeling she couldn't shake. But the girls had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, and at 17 they were old enough to make their own decisions. Against her better judgment, she kissed each daughter goodbye and watched them pile into Jennifer's beat-up Honda Civic, their laughter echoing off the mountains as they drove toward the forest. That was the last time anyone would see the Hartwell triplets alive. When the girls failed to return home by their 10 p.m. curfew, Eleanor initially felt more annoyed than worried. They were teenagers, after all, and Crystal Lake was notorious for poor cell phone reception. But as midnight approached with no sign of her daughters, maternal instinct overrode rational thought. She drove the winding forest roads herself, calling their names into the darkness until her voice grew hoarse. By dawn on July 16th, Eleanor was at the Pine Ridge Sheriff's Department, demanding action. Sheriff Marcus Donovan, a man who had served the community for over 2 decades, immediately organized a search party. The Honda Civic was found within hours, abandoned on Forest Road 247 about 3 miles from Crystal Lake. The car was unlocked, keys still in the ignition, but there was no sign of the girls. What made the discovery even more unsettling were the items left behind. Jennifer's purse sat on the driver's seat, wallet intact with $43 inside. Jessica's hiking boots were placed neatly by the passenger door, as if she had deliberately removed them. Jamie's camera, a birthday gift she treasured, lay on the ground beside the car, its film still inside, unexposed. The search effort expanded rapidly. Volunteers poured in from neighboring towns, and the California Department of Forestry dispatched additional personnel. Dogs were brought in, helicopters swept the canopy, and experienced trackers combed every inch of the surrounding wilderness. But the forest revealed nothing, swallowing the searchers' efforts like water disappearing into dry earth. Then, on July 18th, everything changed. Lightning struck a dead pine tree 12 miles northeast of where the Honda was found. Within hours, what started as a small ground fire exploded into an inferno that would consume over 200,000 acres of forest. The Pine Ridge Fire, as it would later be named, forced the evacuation of the entire town and brought the search for the triplets to an abrupt halt. For 6 weeks, the fire raged out of control. Firefighters from across the state battled the blaze, but the combination of drought conditions, high temperatures, and fierce winds created a perfect storm of destruction. When the flames were finally contained in late August, Vast swaths of the Mendocino National Forest had been reduced to ash and charred stumps. The search for Jessica, Jennifer, and Jamie resumed immediately, but the landscape had been transformed beyond recognition. Familiar landmarks were gone, trails obliterated, and any physical evidence that might have existed had been incinerated. The massive search effort continued for 3 more weeks, but it was clear that if the girls had been in the fire's path, their remains would never be found. Sheriff Donovan officially classified the case as a missing persons investigation, though privately he and everyone else involved assumed the worst. The prevailing theory was that the triplets had become lost in the forest and been caught in the fire. It was a tragic accident, a reminder of nature's terrible power, and after several months of fruitless investigation, the case gradually faded from public attention. Eleanor Hartwell never accepted this explanation. She spent her life savings hiring private investigators, consulting psychics, and following every lead, no matter how far-fetched. She refused to hold a funeral service, maintaining that her daughters were still alive somewhere, waiting to be found. The stress and grief aged her rapidly, turning her prematurely gray and carving deep lines around her eyes. She became a fixture at town meetings, demanding that law enforcement continue the search, but as years passed, her pleas fell on increasingly deaf ears. The town of Pine Ridge slowly rebuilt after the fire, but it was never quite the same. The missing triplets became local legend, whispered about in bars and coffee shops. Some claimed to have seen them walking the forest roads on foggy nights. Others insisted they had moved to another state and started new lives. A few darker theories suggested foul play, but without evidence, these remained nothing more than speculation. Detective Ray Morrison joined the Pine Ridge Sheriff's Department in 2008, 5 years after the disappearance. He inherited a file cabinet full of cold cases, including the Hartwell triplets, but his attention was quickly consumed by more recent crimes. Like his predecessors, Morrison assumed the girls had died in the fire, their case a tragic footnote in the town's history. Years blended together like smoke in the wind. Eleanor Hartwell passed away in 2015, having never learned what happened to her daughters. The case file gathered dust, occasionally referenced when new deputies joined the force but otherwise forgotten. Pine Ridge moved forward, as small towns do, burying its mysteries beneath the weight of daily life. But the forest remembers everything. In 2023, exactly 20 years after the triplets vanished, the firefighter Captain Daniel Reeves was conducting a routine inspection of fire roads in the rebuilt sections of Mendocino National Forest. Reeves was a veteran of the service, having fought fires across the western United States for over 15 years. He had actually been part of the crew that battled the Pine Ridge fire back in 2003, though at the time he had been too junior to know about the missing girls. The section of forest Reeves was inspecting had been replanted after the fire, and 20 years of growth had created a dense canopy of young pines and undergrowth. He was checking the accessibility of Fire Road 312, a narrow track that wound through particularly rugged terrain, when his truck's engine began to overheat. Pulling over to let the radiator cool, Reeves decided to walk the remaining half-mile of road to complete his inspection. The forest was quiet except for the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk. It was peaceful, almost spiritual, the kind of place that reminded him why he had chosen a career protecting these wild spaces. About a quarter-mile from his truck, something caught his eye. Partially hidden beneath a fallen log and 20 years of accumulated forest debris was what appeared to be a piece of faded fabric. Reeves almost dismissed it as litter, but his trained eye noticed something odd about the way it was positioned. The fabric seemed to be wrapped around something solid, something that didn't belong in the natural environment. Curiosity overcoming caution, Reeves approached the object and carefully moved aside the debris. What he found sent ice water through his veins and would reopen one of Pine Ridge's most haunting mysteries. It was a human skull, still partially wrapped in what had once been a bright yellow t-shirt. The fabric was sun-faded and weathered, but the skull was unmistakably human and appeared to have been there for a very long time. Reeves had seen enough death in his career to recognize the significance of his discovery, but what truly unnerved him were the circumstances. The skull was located nearly 8 miles from where the Honda Civic had been found, in a direction that made no logical sense if the triplets had been trying to reach Crystal Lake. More disturbing still, it was positioned in a small clearing that the fire had somehow missed, a pocket of old-growth forest that had survived the 2003 inferno completely untouched. Reeves immediately radioed for backup and contacted the sheriff's department. Within hours, the area was swarming with investigators, forensic specialists, and medical examiners. Detective Morrison, now a seasoned veteran, arrived to oversee what would become the most significant development in the case since the girls first disappeared. The preliminary examination revealed several troubling details. The skull showed signs of blunt force trauma, a spider web of fractures across the temporal bone that suggested a powerful impact. The yellow t-shirt, despite 2 decades of exposure, retained enough of its original color to be positively identified as the same brand and style that Jamie Hartwell had been wearing when she left home. But perhaps most unsettling of all was the positioning of the remains. The skull had been carefully placed on a flat rock, surrounded by smaller stones arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern. This was not the random scattering one would expect from an animal attack or natural decomposition. Someone had put it there intentionally. The discovery sent shockwaves through Pine Ridge. Residents who had long assumed the triplets died in the fire were forced to confront a far more sinister possibility. If Jamie's remains had been deliberately placed in that clearing, what had happened to Jessica and Jennifer? And who would do such a thing? Detective Morrison found himself thrust into the spotlight of a case that had haunted the town for 2 decades. He began by interviewing everyone who had been involved in the original investigation, many of whom were now retired or deceased. Sheriff Donovan, now in his 70s, provided what details he could remember, but admitted that much of the physical evidence from 2003 had been lost or destroyed over the years. The search of the area around the skull discovery was expanded, with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs brought in to scan every inch of the surrounding forest. The effort was painstaking and expensive, but Pine Ridge was determined to finally learn the truth about what happened to the Hartwell triplets. On the 5th day of the expanded search, the dogs hit on something. Buried beneath 3 feet of soil and forest detritus, investigators found what appeared to be the remains of a campsite. The items recovered painted a disturbing picture: rope that had been cut into specific lengths, a hunting knife with traces of blood still detectable on the blade, and most chilling of all, a Polaroid camera containing undeveloped film. The film, miraculously preserved by the cool, dry conditions underground, was rushed to a specialized laboratory for development. Detective Morrison waited anxiously for the results, knowing that whatever those photographs contained would either solve the mystery of the Hartwell triplets or deepen it beyond comprehension. When the photos finally arrived, Morrison found himself staring at images that would be seared into his memory forever. The pictures showed the 3 girls, very much alive but clearly terrified, bound and sitting around what appeared to be the same campsite where the evidence had been found. The photos were taken in sequence, documenting what could only be described as a methodical process of psychological torture. But the most disturbing aspect of the photographs was not what they showed, but what they revealed about the person taking them. The images were composed with an artistic eye, carefully framed and lit, suggesting that whoever had taken the triplets possessed both photographic skill and a deeply disturbed psychology. This was not a crime of passion or opportunity. It was something far more calculated and sinister. The final photograph in the sequence showed something that made Morrison's blood run cold. In the background, barely visible among the trees, was a figure in dark clothing watching the scene unfold. The image was too blurry to make out facial features, but the person's posture suggested they were not part of the main group but rather an observer, that someone documenting the events for their own twisted purposes. Morrison realized he was not dealing with a simple kidnapping or murder case. The evidence suggested the involvement of multiple perpetrators, a level of organization that spoke to something more sinister than a random crime. Someone had planned this carefully, chosen the triplets specifically, and executed their plan with chilling precision. As news of the discoveries leaked to the media, Pine Ridge found itself under intense scrutiny. National news crews descended on the small town, turning the quiet streets into a circus of reporters, cameramen, and true crime enthusiasts. The case that had been forgotten for 20 years suddenly became the subject of intense public fascination. But for Detective Morrison, the media attention was a distraction from the real work of solving the case. He spent long hours poring over the evidence, trying to piece together a timeline of events that made sense. The photographs provided a window into the triplets' final hours, but they raised more questions than they answered. Who had taken the girls? How had they been transported to the remote campsite without being seen? And most importantly, where were the remains of Jessica and Jennifer? The answers to these questions lay hidden somewhere in the vast forest, waiting to be discovered by someone brave enough to look for them. But as Detective Morrison would soon learn, some secrets are buried so deep that finding them requires digging into the darkest corners of human nature. The investigation was only beginning, and the truth about what happened to the Hartwell triplets would prove to be more horrifying than anyone in Pine Ridge could have imagined. The photographs haunted Detective Morrison's dreams for weeks after their development. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the terror in the triplets' faces, the methodical arrangement of their captivity, and that shadowy figure lurking in the background. But it was the professional quality of the images that truly disturbed him. Whoever had taken these pictures possessed both technical skill and a disturbed artistic vision that suggested this was not their first time documenting such horrors. Morrison assembled a task force that included FBI behavioral analysts, forensic anthropologists, and cold case specialists from across California. The federal involvement brought resources that Pine Ridge had never seen before, but it also brought unwanted attention. The small town that had quietly grieved the loss of the Hartwell triplets for 2 decades suddenly found itself at the center of a media firestorm. The behavioral profile that emerged from the photographs painted a chilling picture of the perpetrators. The lead analyst, Dr. Victoria Walsh, had spent 15 years studying serial killers and organized crime rings. Her assessment of the evidence sent shivers through the investigation team. The photographs showed clear signs of ritualistic behavior, she explained during a tense briefing at the Pine Ridge Sheriff's Department. The positioning of the girls, the careful lighting, the sequential nature of the images all pointed to someone who derived satisfaction not just from the act of violence, but from documenting and preserving it. The presence of a second individual suggested either a partnership or a hierarchical relationship where one person directed while another observed and recorded. More disturbing still was Dr. Walsh's analysis of the timeline. The photographs appeared to have been taken over several days, evidenced by changes in lighting conditions and the girls' clothing. This meant the triplets had been held captive for an extended period before their deaths, enduring psychological torture that was carefully orchestrated and documented. The investigation team expanded their search radius, using ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging to scan vast areas of the forest. But the work was slow and methodical, hampered by the dense undergrowth that had reclaimed the burned areas over the past 20 years. But on a gray morning in late October 2023, the search dogs made another discovery that would shatter what remained of Pine Ridge's innocence. 2 miles northeast of where Jamie's skull had been found, buried beneath a carefully constructed cairn of stones, the investigators uncovered the remains of Jessica and Jennifer Hartwell. Unlike their sister's skull, which had been displayed almost ceremonially, the twins' bodies had been interred with what appeared to be ritualistic precision. The forensic examination revealed a level of brutality that shocked even seasoned investigators. Both girls had suffered extensive trauma before death, and the positioning of their remains suggested they had been forced to witness each other's suffering. Most horrifying of all was the discovery of additional photographs buried with the bodies, images that documented the final moments of their lives in excruciating detail. Dr. Margaret Foster, the forensic anthropologist leading the examination, made an observation that would prove crucial to the investigation. The burial site showed signs of regular maintenance over the years. Someone had been returning to this location, clearing away debris, replacing stones, and caring for the makeshift grave in a twisted parody of remembrance. This revelation transformed the investigation from a historical cold case into an active hunt for a living perpetrator. If someone had been tending to the burial site for 20 years, they were still in the area, still connected to Pine Ridge in some way. The killer or killers had not simply disappeared after committing their crimes, they had remained hiding in plain sight within the community. Morrison began the painstaking process of reviewing every resident who had lived in Pine Ridge in 2003 and remained there in 2023. The list was surprisingly short for such a devastating revelation. Pine Ridge was the kind of place where people either left immediately after high school or stayed forever. There was little middle ground. One name that appeared on the list made Morrison's blood run cold: Thomas Kellerman, the town's longtime photographer who had documented weddings, graduations, and community events for over 3 decades. Kellerman had operated a small studio on Main Street and was known for his artistic eye and technical expertise. He had photographed the Hartwell triplets numerous times over the years, including their senior portraits just months before they disappeared. The connection seemed almost too obvious, but Morrison had learned not to dismiss the obvious in favor of the exotic. Many of the most horrific crimes were committed by people who hid in plain sight, using their position in the community to avoid suspicion. Kellerman certainly had the photographic skills evident in the disturbing images found at the burial sites. A deeper investigation into Kellerman's background revealed troubling details that had somehow escaped notice for decades. He had no family, no close friends, and despite his prominent role in documenting the town's history, he remained curiously absent from that history himself. Public records showed he had moved to Pine Ridge in 1987, just 1 year after the triplets were born, but there was virtually no information about his life before that arrival. More unsettling still was the discovery that Kellerman's studio contained a darkroom sophisticated enough to develop the type of high-quality prints found at the crime scenes. When investigators obtained a search warrant for his property, they found a collection that defied comprehension and would haunt the small town for generations to come. The basement of Kellerman's modest home had been converted into what could only be described as a museum of suffering. Hundreds of photographs covered every wall, documenting what appeared to be decades of violence and death. The images were organized chronologically, starting with newspaper clippings and crime scene photos from the 1970s and progressing through increasingly personal and intimate documentation of violence. But it was not just the photographs that horrified investigators. Kellerman had maintained meticulous records, journals that detailed his methodology, his selection criteria, and his psychological state throughout his crimes. The entries revealed a mind that had descended into complete moral darkness while maintaining a facade of normalcy that had fooled an entire community for over 30 years. The journals revealed that the Hartwell triplets were not Kellerman's first victims, nor were they his last. Over the course of 3 decades, he had been responsible for the disappearances of at least 12 people across Northern California, always choosing victims from small communities where his role as a photographer gave him access and credibility. The entries about the triplets were particularly detailed and disturbing. Kellerman had been watching the girls for months before their disappearance, learning their routines, their relationships, and their plans. He had known about their intended trip to Crystal Lake, because Jennifer had mentioned it during her senior portrait session, innocently sharing her excitement about spending time with her sisters before their final year of high school. The plan had been elaborate and carefully executed. Kellerman had sabotaged their car on a remote section of Forest Road 247, then presented himself as a helpful stranger when they found themselves stranded. The girls had trusted him because he was a familiar face, someone who had photographed them at school events and family gatherings. Their trust had cost them their lives. But perhaps most chilling of all was Kellerman's description of his partnership with the shadowy figure captured in the photographs. The journals revealed that he had not acted alone but had worked with someone identified only as the collector, the individual who shared his disturbed interests and helped facilitate his crimes. And the identity of this accomplice became the focus of the investigation's next phase. Kellerman's journals provided tantalizing clues, but never revealed the person's true name or identity. References to the collector appeared throughout decades of entries, suggesting a long-term partnership that had enabled both men to evade detection while claiming numerous victims. Dr. Walsh's analysis of the journal entries suggested that the collector was likely the dominant partner in the relationship, but someone who directed Kellerman's activities and shared in the psychological rewards of their crimes. The behavioral profile indicated someone with significant knowledge of law enforcement procedures, possibly explaining how they had avoided capture for so long. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing Kellerman's financial records, investigators discovered regular payments to a post office box in a neighboring county. The payments had continued for over 20 years, always for the same amount, always on the same date. It was the kind of methodical behavior that characterized everything about Kellerman's crimes. Tracking the post office box led investigators to a man named David Thorne, a retired sheriff's deputy who had worked in various counties throughout Northern California during his 30-year career. Thorne had been part of the original search effort for the Hartwell triplets, one of the volunteers who had combed the forest looking for the missing girls while knowing exactly where they were and what had happened to them. The revelation that a law enforcement officer had been involved in the crimes explained many of the investigation's most puzzling aspects. Thorne's knowledge of police procedures had allowed him and Kellerman to stay one step ahead of investigators for decades. His access to crime scenes and evidence had given them insights into ongoing investigations that helped them avoid detection. When investigators arrived at Thorne's remote cabin, they found he had been expecting them. The former deputy was discovered dead in his study, apparently by suicide, surrounded by evidence that confirmed his role as the collector. A final note detailed his partnership with Kellerman and provided locations for additional burial sites across Northern California. And the scope of their crimes was staggering. Over 3 decades, Kellerman and Thorne had been responsible for the deaths of 27 people, but always choosing victims from small communities where Kellerman could establish himself as a trusted photographer and Thorne could influence or monitor the investigations that followed. The Hartwell triplets had been among their final victims before the 2003 fire forced them to suspend their activities. The massive law enforcement presence during and after the fire had made their usual methods too risky, leading to a 20-year hiatus that had only ended with Thorne's death and Kellerman's subsequent capture. Kellerman's arrest brought little satisfaction to the residents of Pine Ridge. The revelation that their community had harbored such evil for decades left deep psychological scars that would take generations to heal. Families began to question every interaction they had had with the soft-spoken photographer who had documented their most precious moments while secretly planning their return. Destruction. The trial that followed was a media spectacle that transformed Pine Ridge into a reluctant tourist destination for true crime enthusiasts. Kellerman, now in his 70s, showed no remorse for his crimes and seemed to take perverse pleasure in the attention they brought him. His testimony revealed the full extent of his and Thorne's activities, providing closure for dozens of families who had spent years wondering what happened to their missing loved ones. The evidence presented during the trial painted a picture of methodical evil that defied comprehension. Kellerman described his crimes with clinical detachment, discussing his victims as subjects in some twisted artistic endeavor. The photographs he had taken were not just documentation of violence, but carefully composed works of art in his disturbed mind. Eleanor Hartwell's sister, Margaret, attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row where Kellerman could see her. She had moved to Pine Ridge after Eleanor's death to maintain the family home and had become the triplets' advocate in their mother's absence. Her presence in the courtroom served as a reminder of the human cost of Kellerman's crimes. The verdict was never in doubt. Kellerman was convicted on 27 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, though at his age, he would likely die of natural causes before the sentence could be carried out. The trial provided legal closure, but the psychological wounds inflicted on Pine Ridge would take much longer to heal. In the months following the trial, the town struggled to reclaim its identity. The Main Street photography studio was demolished, and the lot where it stood was converted into a small memorial garden dedicated to all of Kellerman and Thorne's victims. The garden featured 27 trees, one for each life lost, arranged in a circle around a simple granite marker that bore no names, only dates. Detective Morrison retired shortly after the trial, Unable to continue his law enforcement career after spending months immersed in such profound evil, he moved away from Pine Ridge, seeking distance from the memories that haunted the small town. In his final report, he noted that while the case was officially closed, the psychological impact on the community would persist for generations. The forest where the Hartwell triplets had died was designated a memorial preserve, protected from development and maintained as a place of remembrance. Hiking trails were established leading to markers at each of the burial sites, and thus allowing visitors to pay their respects in a setting of natural beauty that contrasted sharply with the horror that had occurred there. Captain Daniel Reeves, the firefighter whose discovery had reopened the case, continued his work protecting the forests of Northern California. He often reflected on the strange twist of fate that had led him to that skull on a routine inspection. The forest had kept its secrets for 20 years, but in the end it had also revealed them, allowing the truth to finally emerge from decades of darkness. The Hartwell triplets, Jessica, Jennifer, and Jamie, were finally laid to rest in a ceremony that brought the entire community together. On their graves in the Pine Ridge Cemetery became a pilgrimage site for those affected by their story, the reminder of lives cut short by unimaginable evil but not forgotten by those who loved them. The case officially closed on a cold December morning in 2024, exactly 1 year after firefighter Reeves made his gruesome discovery. Thomas Kellerman died in his prison cell, taking with him any remaining secrets about his decades of violence. David Thorne's suicide had already silenced the other half of their partnership, leaving only the evidence they had so meticulously preserved to tell their story. Pine Ridge slowly began to heal, but the town would never be the same. And the revelation that such evil had hidden among them for so long changed how residents looked at each other and at strangers. Trust, once freely given in the small community, became something that had to be earned and constantly re-evaluated. The case became a subject of study for law enforcement agencies across the country, an example of how organized killers could operate for decades in plain sight when they understood the systems designed to catch them. The partnership between Kellerman and Thorne demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of combining photographic access with law enforcement knowledge. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Hartwell case was its reminder that evil often wears a familiar face. The monsters that parents warn their children about are not always strangers lurking in shadows. Sometimes they are the trusted members of the community, the people who document life's most precious moments while secretly planning their destruction. The triplets' story serves as a testament to the importance of never giving up on the missing, never accepting that some mysteries are destined to remain unsolved. Eleanor Hartwell had spent her final years demanding that the search for her daughters continue, and though she did not live to see justice served, her persistence ensured that the truth eventually emerged. 20 years after 3 young women left home for a day at the lake and never returned, their story finally reached its conclusion. Justice had been served, closure had been achieved, and the dead could finally rest in peace. But the scars left on Pine Ridge would serve as a permanent reminder that in small towns where everyone knows everyone, sometimes the person you trust most is the one you should fear. The forest remembers everything, and eventually it reveals its secrets to those brave enough to look for them.